Yeah.
Okay, let me know when.
We're live now.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this introduction to the US EXIM Bank, hosted by the Oman American Business Center in partnership with the US Embassy in Muscat. My name is Fuad Eid, and I'm the Vice President of the OABC. I'm also the Europe, Middle East, and Africa Vice President for Champion X, an oil and gas services company. If it's your first time joining us for an event like this one, welcome and thank you for coming. Before we get started, I'd like to inform everyone that this session will be recorded so that we can share this event with members and colleagues who are unable to attend. As we have many guests with us today, I want to take 1 minute to talk a little bit about the OABC and our vision and mission. The OABC is the official affiliate of the US Chamber of Commerce in Oman and is also Oman's largest and most active professional business networking organization. We have a mission to foster commercial development between the US and the Sultanate of Oman. The OABC hosts around 30 events per year, currently mostly on Zoom, but usually we have them face-to-face. We connect executives in Oman and the US in many ways and make it easier for people to do business. Today, we have around 160 member companies, including around 36 member companies who joined us or who joined our business community during the pandemic. Quite impressive. If you'd like to learn more about how to join or how we can support your company or your business, please get in touch with my colleague, Rebecca Olson. I think Rebecca is going to put her email ID on the chat window, so please contact her. This event has come about after the visit of the EXIM Bank delegation to Oman in January, including Chairman and President Kimberly Reed. When we met, the delegation shared with the OABC about the amazing and very competitive financing opportunities EXIM Bank has to offer companies who are buying American products or services. And we all decided then and there to share this information with companies in Oman and throughout the GCC. So thank you, Rick, for your time today in preparing this presentation, and welcome to all of those attending from other regional American Chamber of Commerce affiliates throughout the GCC. And now I'd like to thank the OABC premium members. Now this slide usually goes up at our in-person events to give visibility and special appreciation to these companies. A huge thank you to each of these companies for being committed and active premium members of the OABC and for sponsoring the work at the highest possible level. Your support helps to keep the OABC on the right track, especially in challenging times like these. And now for some housekeeping rules. We ask that you please stay muted while our guests and speakers are presenting. We'll take questions at the end of the presentation, so please put your questions into the chat box and we'll try to answer as many of them as we can towards the end of the presentation. On behalf of the Board of Directors, I'd like to introduce our first guest of honor, US Ambassador Leslie Tsou, to give opening remarks. Ambassador Tsou arrived as US Ambassador to Oman in January 2020, having previously served as Deputy Chief of Mission of the US Embassy in Jerusalem and in posts throughout the Middle East and in Washington. Ambassador, we're very thankful for the incredible collaboration between our two organizations and for the hard work you and your staff undertake every day. We're looking forward to what you have to share with us today. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Tsou.
Thank you, Fawad, for your very kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here with everyone today. I also want to thank the Oman American Business Center for organizing this event. And I am particularly delighted that Her Excellency, the Undersecretary of Ministry of Commerce, Industry, and Trade Investment Promotion, Asila bin Salim Al-Samsami, is participating in our program today. To her, I want to express my government's appreciation for her efforts to further strengthen the US-Oman commercial relationship. And most importantly, thanks and welcome to all of you for joining us today for this virtual workshop, an introduction to the Export-Import Bank of the United States. I wish I could greet you in person, and I hope the time is coming when we may be able to meet face to face. In the meantime, we have put together an excellent program featuring our expert speaker from the Export-Import Bank in Washington, Mr. Rick Angiuoni. Thanks to Mr. Angiuoni for generously offering us his expertise and time. In January, then Chairman of EXIM Bank, Kimberly Reed, visited Oman to promote business between our two countries. During that visit, and upon the OABC's suggestion, the U.S. Embassy agreed to facilitate a webinar in Oman that explains EXIM's programs and services. Today's webinar is a result of these conversations and of EXIM's ongoing commitment to promoting international commerce by extending loans, commercial loan guarantees, and export credit insurance for the export of U.S. goods and services to Oman and other markets. As you know, Oman and the United States share a long and prosperous partnership, bolstered by the U.S.-Oman Free Trade Agreement, which has been the anchor of our trade and investment relationship. In 2020, the United States and Oman traded nearly $2 billion worth of goods, supporting livelihoods for workers and their families in both of our countries. Buyers around the world value American products and services for their high levels of quality, ingenuity, and customer service. EXIM helps foreign enterprises and governments purchase U.S. products and services. It supports exports of large and small U.S. businesses across many sectors, including those in the infrastructure, power, agriculture, aviation, healthcare, and technology services. EXIM therefore forms an important bridge in our bilateral trade partnership that we are working to expand. Through today's webinar, we hope to promote greater awareness in Oman of EXIM's products and services and to familiarize Omani customers with EXIM's products. In doing so, we are looking for EXIM to be a bridge for increased U.S.-Oman trade and investment. Mr. Angiuoni will present to you some important information on EXIM's programs available to Omani purchasers of U.S. goods and services. Let me conclude my remarks by saying that my colleagues and I at the U.S. Embassy welcome you to explore opportunities for doing business with the United States through EXIM Bank. We believe that having more Omani entities take advantage of EXIM products will advance bilateral commercial opportunities and increase prosperity for Americans and Omanis alike. Thank you once again for joining us, and back to you, Fawad.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now it's also my honor to introduce Her Excellency Asila bint Salim Al-Samsami, Undersecretary of the Ministry of Commerce, Industry, and Investment Promotion. Previously, Her Excellency Asila led and facilitated a study on the impact of the Fourth Industrial Revolution in PDO, which is Petroleum Development of Oman, in 2019. She led the development of the Turnaround Initiative, which became another successful story as it materialized to become the first strategic project aimed at localizing the turnaround activities in the oil and gas sector and enabling national capabilities in the relevant jobs in the Sultanate of Oman, as part of the In-Country Value Initiative or local content. Today, Her Excellency leads a highly focused team of people who are devoted to their mandate to increase investment in Oman and support exports from Oman to countries from all over the world. We've had the pleasure of meeting together and learning more about the great vision the new directorate has. Thank you, Your Excellency, for joining us and sharing your remarks.
Thank you, Fuad. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is a pleasure and an honor to be part of today's EXIM Bank International Buyer webinar. First of all, let me thank Her Excellency Leslie, Ambassador of the United States of America to the Sultanate of Oman, and Mr. Ali Dawood, the Chairman of Oman American Business Center, Mrs. Rebecca, Oman ABC's Executive Director and the Center's Head of Corporate Relations, and Mrs. Lynn George for making today's events possible. We greatly appreciated the significant effort and the considerable time you have taken to bring us all together today. Thank you. I would like to also express our gratitude to Mr. Rick, Business Development Specialist and the Regional Director of Africa, EXIM, for joining today's session. We are honored to have you with us today, and we're looking forward hearing your insight on enhancing Oman-US trade, as well as learning more about EXIM Bank, suites of trade financing tools for international buyers of US goods and services. Thank you all for participating. I am keen to discuss how we can strengthen trade ties, increase economic collaboration, and benefit this could bring our respective business communities. In fact, in this year, we are celebrating the 12th anniversary of an important milestone in our relations, the Oman-US Free Trade Agreement, a landmark signing that has opened up many outstanding commercial opportunities for our two countries. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, today's webinar presents us with an outstanding opportunity to discuss many exciting possibilities that exist for US business in Oman economic development. And we are eager to hear how we can better facilitate your participation in our growing economy. And with introduction of a new foreign investment policy, we have delivered a better than ever pro-business environment, making it even easier to take an advantage for our outstanding business opportunity in logistics, fisheries, mining, tourism, manufacturing, and so much more. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, I am excited about today's possibility in the discussion regarding our diversifying economy is opening up to our business community and international partners for our export as well as for the investors in Oman. Indeed, we look forward to exploring the opportunity of the MOU recently initiated by our Foreign Minister, His Excellency Sayyid Badr, and the EXIM Chairman. For a particular interest are those opportunity for EXIM financing in 5G wireless communication equipment, biotechnology, renewable energy, agriculture, mining, and manufacturing in order to achieve more export programs, promotion programs, and EXIM trade finance solution. To conclude, I am very grateful to Her Excellency Leslie and her staff and Oman ABC management for organizing today's webinar, and looking forward to have a very successful session of today's meeting. Thank you for your time, and I'm really excited about the details of this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And now I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Mr. Rick Angiuoni, Business Development Specialist and Director of Africa in the Office of Board Authorized Finance at EXIM Bank. Rick joined the Export-Import Bank of the United States in March 2009. Rick has been responsible for developing EXIM Bank's activities with Africa and is engaged in the development of the US government's Prosper Africa strategy. In the 10 years Rick has worked at EXIM Bank, the portfolio has grown its annual credit authorizations from 500 million in 2009 to over 5 billion in the fiscal year 2019. He's assisted in the origination and underwriting of both small and large transactions in over 44 countries across Africa. Rick previously served as director of HSBC in New York as part of the team responsible for export finance. Rick began his international banking career on Wall Street, working with JP Morgan Chemical Bank, followed by positions at Bankers Trust in New York and in London. Thanks for your time today, Rick, and you're welcome to begin. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Faoud. Thank you for the introduction. And I would like to take a couple moments to acknowledge Her Excellency Asila and our great ambassador, Ambassador Tsou. It's really my honor to make this presentation and to follow Chairman Reed's visit to Oman, where she signed the $500 million MOU. While I wish I were there in person, I am pleased to join you via social media. Today, I will be speaking about EXIM Bank, and this is an EXIM 101. I will try to make it very simple because banking is simple, and I hope I can meet your expectations. Please, next slide. So in speaking about EXIM Bank is the export credit agency of the US government. EXIM Bank was founded in 1934, so we are roughly 85 years old. And our mission is to finance US exports. What is important about also EXIM Bank is that we have enormous capacity to lend. Our balance sheet is $135 billion, and we are keen to support US exports going to Oman and to the Gulf region. Next slide. So as I have mentioned, the mission of the bank is to finance US exports. This slide is to basically highlight, the exports that comes to the region. Obviously, you could see that exports have somewhat declined over the last 3 years. We are hoping for a strong recovery, and we hope that the recovery will include significant investments which we can finance. In terms of exposure, what is interesting also is that the region is critically very important to us. Our exposure is quite significant, obviously with Saudi Arabia as being one of the largest exposures, and followed by UAE. Oman, obviously, we have a very small exposure, but clearly Oman is a much smaller country than Saudi Arabia. But there are a number of transactions, and our pipeline is quite significant, that I see some great potential across the countries in the region, including Oman. Next slide, please. And speaking about transactions, everything is about doing transactions that can generate economic activity and create jobs both here in America as well as in the host countries. One of the biggest transactions ever completed in the region was the Sadara petrochemical complex. This was the largest transaction in the history of the bank at that time. Another transaction that recently has been completed, which is basically about the same size, is in Mozambique, is Mozambique LNG, which is roughly the same amount that we've authorized. We were very proud, and we're proud of the joint venture between Aramco and Dow Chemical. Next slide, please. And so, as the ambassador noted, and as Her Excellency also has noted, we were proud of our then Chairman Reid, visiting Oman and signing a $500 million MOU. Clearly, this MOU, I like to think of it as a down payment, because given the capacity of our balance sheet, we can do much more. But we are very conscious of Oman's Vision 2040 and about enhancing economic linkages and trade between Oman, the region, and America. Next slide. So I'm starting now about speaking a little bit about EXIM Bank. As I have mentioned, EXIM Bank is a finance agency. We operate very much like a bank. And I will be speaking about some of our products. I will be speaking about a lot of Cs, a lot of Ps, and a lot of Rs. Okay, and what are the Cs and Ps and the Rs? Basically, the Cs are the country, content, and credit. The Ps are people's product and price, and the Rs are reach, risk, and return. You will notice in my presentation, I will be speaking a lot about the Cs, the Ps, and the Rs. So if you just remember the Cs, the Ps, and the Rs, I can assure you that you will be much more knowledgeable about EXIM Bank's operations, about banking, about finance, and about EXIM Bank's policies. So this slide basically, okay, illustrates the programs of the bank. It's very simple programs. They're trade-driven programs. The programs of the bank can be divided into two types. One are our short-term programs, and the other ones are medium and long-term programs. The short-term programs are primarily supplier credits. These are insurance products where we provide insurance to US exporters that sell goods abroad, that sell goods to Oman. And in fact, what's interesting is that if you look currently at Oman, our exposure is primarily export credit insurance, where we have insured receivables for US exporters selling goods to Oman. The other type of program is the medium and long-term program. This is what I call primarily buyer credits. This is where we provide loans to buyers to buy US goods and services. And there are various forms of programs that we have under this. We could still do medium-term insurance. We could do loan guarantees. We can do direct loans. And then we have some special programs related to project and structured finance, very much like the Sadara Petrochemical Complex, as well as aircraft is also a special program, such as our financing for Emirates. Next slide, please. So you recall that I was speaking about the 3 Cs, okay? So if you can remember the 3 Cs of EXIM Bank, I think you will have passed the test, and you will be much more knowledgeable on how to work with EXIM Bank. So basically, if we look at the 3 Cs, the first C that I like to refer to as our cover policy or country, we must be open in the buyer's country. So clearly, if you look at the region, we are open across the board. We're open in Oman, Saudi, Bahrain. We're open across the board. So we are open to do business in these countries, okay? Content, this is very much important, that our mission is to finance exports. So we pay close attention to made in USA. So in order for us to finance exports from the US, certain content requirements must have been met. I will review the content, basically eligibility, but I'm not going to go really into the weeds. I will explain that. And last but not least, a transaction has to be creditworthy. We want to make sure the transactions meet reasonable assurance of repayment. We want to make sure that projects are sound. As projects are sound, economic activity could increase, and as well as jobs can be created. Okay, next slide. And so I was speaking about the first C, cover policy and country. So clearly, if you look at this slide, you could see that in Oman, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, we are open across the board. That's not true about every country, that we deal with. I am the director of Africa, and I can tell you, obviously, that there are many countries in Africa where the risk of doing business, is very high. Their risk profile is high, and we are not open across the board. We may not even be open in certain countries, and in other countries we may only be open short term. But in this case, okay, we are open across the board, short, medium, and long term, both in the public sector as well as in the private sector. Next slide. And so I was speaking then about content. This is the second C that I was speaking about, okay? Now, content is fairly easy from our standpoint. The arithmetic is simple. At times, getting to actually calculating and figuring out exactly what the US content is, it's a little bit more complicated, but that's generally done by a US exporter. But the arithmetic is very simple. And basically, you just have to remember, the the formula that we have at the bottom, the asterisk, and the asterisk basically says that EXIM Bank finances the lesser of, okay, 85% of the value of eligible goods and services, or 100% of the US content. So if we look at this slide and the calculation, you can see that the arithmetic is quite simple. So if we start out with a US supply contract of 100 million, this kind of assumes that if we start out with a US supply contract of 100 million, okay, and then we have US content and eligible foreign content of 70 and 10, that means that basically then I'm saying that 20 million is not eligible foreign content and is taken out of the equation, right? Okay, so basically taking out that 20 million, which is assumed is ineligible foreign content that we cannot finance, ineligible meaning that it was something produced abroad and then it was exported from abroad to Oman, for example, that would be excluded. So we would exclude that $20 million from the calculation. And we come to US content. Then we also have a definition of eligible foreign content. For example, we obviously know, with the global supply chain that there could be in the US content some foreign content coming from another country. And so that is allowed, only a certain percentage is allowed. So I am adding $10 million of eligible foreign content. So coming to a net contract price of 80 million, okay? From the net contract price of 80 million, we generally deduct, okay, by policy, we deduct the 15% down payment, which is a requirement, and we come to the finance portion of 68 million. As part of our financing, we're also allowed, okay, to finance local costs. Okay, it's not just made in USA. We're also allowed to finance local costs because, as you could imagine, in many projects, you have local costs, you have local labor, and therefore we are allowed to finance that. And we generally finance up to 30% of the net contract price for local costs. So obviously 30% of 80 million, it comes down to 24 million. So the 68 plus 24 million, or total financed amount could be as much as $92 million. In addition, we could finance, for example, because we do charge a premium for taking the risk, okay, we could also capitalize the premium as part of our total financed amount. Next slide, please. The next slide basically summarizes kind of the credit that we're looking for, the third C, okay? And if we look at the credit, we generally look at the primary source of repayment. As I have mentioned, okay, EXIM Bank is an export credit agency, but we are effectively a bank. We are a finance agency. And so, in banking is simple. We lend money and we expect to get repaid. Generally, we have a counterparty that is the beneficiary of our loan. And the counterparty could be a corporate entity, or it could be a sovereign, for example, or it could be a financial institutions. Financial institutions play a critical role, for example, in financing commodities. Many of our transactions where we finance commodities are done through financial institutions. And so, that could be an area that we can obviously explore also for Oman in potentially financing commodities, but that is an area that we can explore. But basically, there are three types of borrowers. You have corporate borrowers where we look at the balance sheet of that corporate and the strength of their financials in order for us to determine reasonable assurance of repayment. Similar due diligence is with financial institutions. And obviously, sovereign, we look at debt sustainability, which if we look at Oman and if we look at the various countries in the region, clearly we see them as low risk, okay? So our appetite for taking risk in the region is enormous, okay? Next slide, please. Here is basically, this slide is to illustrate a little bit more the specific products that we have, as I have indicated. Now I'm beginning to speak about the P's, right? People, product, and price, okay? And these are the, the type of products that we have. And as I have mentioned, we have short-term products and we have medium and long-term products, okay? The short-term products, for example, are primarily insurance products. Generally, the buyer doesn't even get involved in insurance. We provide insurance against the payment risk to an exporter without even the buyer knowing about it, okay? And there are various policies that exporters, US exporters have with EXIM Bank, okay? And where we provide this type of insurance, okay? And then we have the medium term, the buyer credits, and the long-term project finance and long-term products where we provide guarantees and we provide direct loans. And also we provide structured finance products like some of the projects that we've done in the Middle East that I will discuss further. Next slide. And basically, in speaking about short-term insurance, this is basically the example and the illustration of the various policies that an exporter, okay, would have to insure receivables against payment risk, okay? And clearly, a classic example would be where a US exporter selling to an Omani buyer, providing credit terms, providing, 90 days or 180 days or 360 days. And obviously they may want to have that receivable insured. They may want to go to their financial institution and draw down under that receivable. And so they come to us under an insurance policies where we look at insuring the credit from that Omani buyer. So we do due diligence on that transaction. If we like the risk, we approve the credit, okay? Those are basically, that's the basic structure of short-term insurance where the buyer doesn't even actually get involved in the process. Next slide, please. The next product that we have, and this is one of the biggest products that we have, is our guarantee product. Our guarantee product is basically where we provide a guarantee to a lender to advance funds to a buyer to purchase US goods and services. So why do we do that? The guarantee to the lender is basically the guarantee of the US government, is the guarantee of the full faith and credit of the US government. So effectively the lender is not taking a buyer risk, is not taking credit risk. We are the ones who are taking credit risk. So the lender can pass on the benefits of the EXIM's guarantee, which obviously represents the lowest cost of borrowing in the world, to that buyer. Under the guarantee program, okay, basically an application is submitted by the lender. It could be possibly submitted even by the buyer. EXIM Bank, as I mentioned to you, guarantees 85%. We require a 15% down payment. The terms of the financing, because it is the lender providing funds, then the terms of the financing are negotiated between the lender and buyer. Obviously, we do review all of that, but there is flexibility where the lender does due diligence, advances funds, you negotiate pricing, and the lender submits the application and does all the due diligence, okay? Next slide, please. The next product that we have is a direct loan. Under the direct loan program, this is where EXIM Bank lends funds directly to a borrower, okay? In cases where we lend funds directly to a borrower, generally this is in very big transactions, okay? Our funding is fixed rate, is based over US Treasuries, and typically an international borrower submits an application to EXIM Bank. Then there are certain requirements regarding direct loans, but I'm not going to get into all of the requirements. But what's important is that in this case, unlike a lender under our guarantee program advancing funds, okay, it is EXIM Bank who's actually advancing funds to the borrower, okay? Next slide. And this slide is to highlight that, as I mentioned, banking is quite simple. Okay, as I mentioned, banking is about lending money and expecting to get repaid. But it can get very complicated, and they can get complicated when we are involved in doing project finance transactions. And for example, in Saudi, this would be a classic case, for example, of Aqua Power, okay, where they have been involved in a number of power projects around the world. And I'm fully familiar with some of their projects. But this is a case where it's project finance. It's basically limited recourse project finance. In this case, you don't really have, as we discussed before, there are three types of borrowers. You could have a corporate, you could have a financial institution, you could have a sovereign. In this case, actually, in project finance, you basically have an asset. You basically have a special purpose vehicle that is created by a sponsor. Obviously, the transaction and the project has to be sound. It is capitalized by both equity and debt, okay? And then you have a project that is supposed to generate some goods. In this case, it will be, the example shows where power is generated and where power is going to be sold to an off-taker. And so the project is quite complex. And basically, the project in project finance, it's basically a series of commercial contracts to ensure the economics of the project is sound, that the credit is sound, that the sponsor is strong, that the feedstock is there. This is, of course, the government gets very much involved because it has to do a lot with providing certain regulations and approvals. So this is typically, the structure of a project finance transaction. Next slide, please. And as I've indicated to you, project finance can be complicated. As I mentioned, it has to be, as I've said, the project has to be capitalized by debt and equity. The reason why we want to see equity in the project is because we want to have the sponsor to take a risk, and that is a subject of negotiation always when we work with sponsors, because clearly we would like to see them put in more equity, and they would like to put in less equity in order to obviously, improve the ROI on the project. There are all kinds of credit enhancements as part of the projects to ensure basically that the project is completed. We're very much about construction risk, so we look at contractors who can deliver on the project. Next slide, please. And then repayment terms, okay? Now we're speaking about some of the R's. Remember, we're speaking about the R's. I spoke about, reach, risk and return, and repayments. So repayment terms, it can go anywhere, okay? Our financing, as I mentioned, in the countries in the region, we are open across the board from short to long term. And our financing can go from site letters of credits to over 18 to 20 years for a renewable energy project. Next slide. And our pricing, okay? The P's, pricing. So basically our pricing is really transparent, okay? You can look on our website and you can see our pricing, okay? And this has to do a lot with us financing direct loans, okay? And our pricing is based on US Treasuries. Obviously, you could see that interest rates are quite low, and they've been very low for some time now. But you could see that our pricing is based on US Treasuries. Generally, we add 1% above the US Treasury rate that corresponds to that type of maturity profile of the loan. So you could see for an 18-year loan, for example, whether it's in Oman or whether it's in Saudi, for an 18-year loan, okay, our pricing for that loan, direct loan, would be 2.28% currently, okay? Of course, then we also have certain premiums that we charge in order to compensate for the risk, okay? Next slide. And the process, okay? Now I have simplified the process. I like to keep things simple. Here I have simplified the process. It can get a little bit complicated, but generally it's a 5-step process. Okay, for us to review transactions, okay, we need to have an export contract. We need to have a commercial contract between a buyer and the seller. Generally, before even the export contract takes place, you have exporters and possibly even buyers approaching me, and asking us what our typical financing arrangements are in order to support that export contract. So generally, with an export contract where financing is required, we could support that financing by an initial letter of interest or a letter of support, okay? If the contract is consummated and the financing is of interest, then the next step is an application process. As I have mentioned, under the guarantee program, the US exporter or the proposed lender, because remember, under the guarantee program, who's advancing funds is the lender. So obviously the lender is the one who generally submits an application to EXIM Bank, okay? So under the EXIM Bank, so an application is submitted. Under the direct loan, in this case, the application is generally submitted by the borrower. What does the application include? The application is fairly simple, but it depends on the transaction. If it's a project finance transaction, obviously it's much more complicated because you have all kinds of due diligence. You have legal due diligence, you have environmental due diligence. But if it's a simple export transaction, then we look at the contract, and we look at the technical aspect of the project, and we review the exporter, we review the buyer, we review the credit, and then that would be as part of our due diligence. If it's a question of a public sector transaction, and we may need, in this case, for example, Ministry of Finance approval, then we will also seek that Ministry of Finance approval. After all of that is done, okay, an application is submitted to the board. You met Chairman Reed. An application is submitted to the board, and I'm pleased to say that EXIM Bank currently does have a quorum of the board. An application is submitted to the board. If it's above a certain amount, it's submitted to the board. Smaller transactions are not. We have delegated authority to support many of the insurance transactions, but an application is submitted to the board. If the board approves the transaction, then it goes into documentation, okay? So then the lawyers get involved in putting together the loan agreements in order to finance the transactions. After the loan agreements have been completed, generally you have a typical, in a loan agreement, you have conditions precedents that have to be met. Once that the conditions precedents are met, our disbursements begin. Next slide. And so obviously there is an upcoming event. Obviously, I'm very familiar with Qatar 2022, but this is not the event. Hopefully I can be there in person for Qatar 2022. But this is an upcoming event that is going to be a great event, sponsored by our fine colleague at the Department of Commerce. It's going to be on March 15th and 16th, and this is on infrastructure. One event is going to be for the UAE. The other event is going to be for Saudi Arabia. It is free, so I urge everyone to sign up. Next slide. And this is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rick, for the excellent presentation that was very clear and well laid out and quick. So we have time for Q&A before we close the evening. And there's already a few questions here. So I'm glad you have some water. We'll get started with the very first one. Do you offer any finance that complies with Islamic banking? This member is saying, I'm sure if you consider this type of finance, that will increase again the amount of finance.
Yes, absolutely. We are very much familiar with Islamic banking, and we also have close collaboration with the Islamic Development Bank. we have not done much of Islamic banking, but again, based on due diligence that we've done in the past, we would be in a position to do Islamic banking financing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, and I guess I should introduce myself. I've not been on the call yet. Everyone who doesn't know me, I'm Rebecca Olson, Executive Director of the OAVC. And I have another question. How many contracts have been executed with Oman till now with EXIM Bank?
Right. So you saw the exposure, okay? The exposure in Oman is currently very small, okay? It's roughly around 3 million, okay? Compared to Saudi, almost 5 billion, 4 to 5 billion. The number of transactions that we've done are primarily short-term insurance, okay? I do not have a number exactly of how many transactions have been done in Oman since we have been operating, but the number of transactions are short-term insurance, and there are just a few transactions that we've completed given the amount of exposure that we have of 3 million. Yet, however, I would like to say that we do have a pipeline of transactions, as I have mentioned, and I am very excited about the pipeline of transactions in the region, which includes Oman. Based on what I can see, it is quite significant. I don't want to say a specific number, but it is quite significant across the whole region, in Bahrain, in Oman, in Saudi. I can tell you it is quite significant. And so we are excited about continuing our due diligence on some of these projects and then on some of these transactions. And in particular, Oman, we are excited about some of the transactions that we have in our pipeline.
Okay. Great. It sounds like they're in the process. Very good. Then there's a question here about services. I think you've touched on this, but just to confirm to everybody one more time that services can be financed with EXIM Bank.
Absolutely. Yes, services can be financed. That's US services can be financed. So it's not just about manufactured goods. It does include services. If you look at a project finance transaction, there are millions of services, that are provided, and those are all financed, provided that they are construed as U.S. services.
Okay, thank you. And then there's another question here. Can you explain the cash contribution of 15%?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Can you explain the cash contribution of 15%?
Right, excellent. Yeah, the cash contribution of 15%, I am pleased that you asked that question. That is not so much an EXIM Bank requirement, okay? That is a requirement of the OECD. EXIM Bank, as an export credit agency, is part of the OECD arrangement. The OECD arrangement is to make it a level playing field among exporters who are members of the OECD. And that makes obviously commercial sense, right? And so the requirement of the 15%, okay, is a requirement of the OECD, which we also implement. That does not necessarily mean that that an exporter cannot require like 20%, or an exporter cannot require 40% or whatever, okay? That's a commercial decision. What we require is that we see evidence that a 15% down payment has been made. Now, at the same time, obviously, that 15% means that we are not financing that 15%. okay? But that also does not mean that a borrower cannot have a parallel loan to finance that 15%. We just want to see evidence that the exporter has received a portion of that 15%. Also, that does not mean, let's say that you have a $100 million contract, okay? That does not mean that on day one, okay, on day one, when we start the disbursements, that we see that you have paid $15 million to that exporter. It's generally on a pro rata basis. If there is a disbursement by EXIM Bank of 10 million, okay, as part of that contract, then we want to see a corresponding 15% that has been paid, okay, that we are not financing. So we would want to see that a $1.5 million that has been paid. That's what that means.
Okay, thank you. So when do the repayments begin?
That's a very good question. Repayment generally begins, it depends on the project, and it depends on the underlying transaction. If it is a project, okay, if it's a project that, as we discussed, like Sadara Petrochemical, generally repayment begins 6 months after completion, okay? So you may have, for example, a project that it will take 2 years, 3 years to complete, okay? Okay, so the repayment would start 6 months after completion date, okay? Okay, so you obviously have construction, then you typically would have an engineer that would certify to the completion, and then repayment begins on whatever has been dispersed by EXIM Bank. Repayment begins 6 months from that completion date, okay? In a case, for example, where you have, for example, the sale of medical equipment, for example, okay? That could be a medium-term transaction. Generally, repayment begins 6 months from shipment date. That's basically the difference, okay? Generally, we allowed 6 months, okay? But in a case of project finance, the project has to be completed in order to generate revenue, right? So we allow, the construction period, okay, before repayment begins. In a case such as medical equipment, that will start generating. The idea is cash conversion cycle. The idea is when will this transaction start generating revenue? In the case of medical equipment, it's going to be put into use very quickly, and so it will perform its economic activity. So the repayment starts 6 months generally from shipment date.
All right, thank you so much. There's another very good question here that says some of our products are made in Canada by our US suppliers. Can these be covered?
The answer is no, because remember, it's not, even if it's a US company that is manufacturing the goods in Canada, we will not be able to finance it. The requirement is basically that it has to be manufactured in the US and it has to be exported from the US, right? In synthesis, that is the requirement. It's very much made in USA. Now I should mention, our content requirements are what they are. I have explained, provided an overview, but we are taking, as Our Excellency mentioned, and Ambassador Tsou mentioned, the MOU, and the MOU also dealing with some, transformational exports. In that case, then I think if it's a product that we construe as part of our mandate on transformational exports, okay, then I think we could take a more flexible view. So the question is good, but it really also depends on the products. But clearly, there has to be some basis for made in USA, manufactured into USA. Then it becomes a question of how flexible we can work with our content policy in financing eligible and then ineligible foreign content. So But in synthesis, the answer to that, made in Canada, the answer is no.
Okay, thank you for being so thorough. I understand it's different with the transformational sectors and there's flexibility, but that's really helpful to know. The same person had another question. What is the minimum size of any application for an EXIM transaction?
Okay, there is no minimum and there is no maximum, okay? As I mentioned to you, it's very interesting that the minimum size, I like to give an example of fishing lures, Fishing lures, they may cost $5 a piece, but given that I deal with Africa, we have a great client in Africa that buys fishing lures from the US. And the exporter, obviously, the question may be for small transaction, why would an exporter, insure a receivable, a small receivable of fishing lures? Well, they may not know anything about that buyer. So, in the case of short-term insurance transaction, really, there is no minimum. It really depends on what the exporters want to insure. And they have various insurance policies, single buyer policies, multi-buyer policies, and they put everything under those policies. And there is no maximum, as I made reference to Sadara Petrochemical, where we have, where our financing was $5 billion. But clearly, there's always, even though we also say we don't have any country limit, but in doing due diligence of credit, there is always some maximum. The maximum depends on the economics of the project, and the maximum depends on how much U.S. content is in the transaction.
Okay. Yes, thank you so much. The next question, and we have just 3 more minutes actually. So what I think we'll do, if it's okay with you, could drink some more water. I think I'll just close for those who need to leave. And then Rick has graciously agreed to stay on after 6 to answer the rest of these questions or any more that come up until around 6:15, 6:20. But we want to honor those who have commitments at 6 o'clock Oman time. And I just wanted to tell everyone, especially those who are here from other American chambers outside of Oman, that we're looking forward to one of our next events being a networking session for all of us to meet here on Zoom and go into rooms and network together face to face. And that will be at the end of March on the 31st. We're working together with each country's AmCham to organize this. So thank you for joining us. For anyone who needs to leave, it was wonderful to have you. And now I'll take the next question and I'll ask Ray. So the next question is, can EXIM Bank help us to get a list of US exporters in fields of water and power development?
Well, certainly I think EXIM Bank can, but the AmChams and AmCham Oman seems to have some really great people. I'm sure they also can. I'm sure our embassy can, or Department of Commerce. So absolutely, I think if you could send a request, you could call the commercial attaché at the embassy. You could reach out to me. I think we definitely, that is something that we can help you with.
Excellent. And the next question is about the general timeline for the process. I'm sure it depends on the size of the project, but is there a typical timeline for getting financing?
Right. There is no transaction, no project is the same, as you can appreciate. Okay. I'll give you some ranges. Okay. On a large project finance, highly complex transaction like the one that I was making reference to, like a power project, the amount of time could be as much as a year and a half. At times it's 2 years. At times it's not even EXIM Bank delaying it. It's getting all the information. It's getting all of the advisors in line. It's getting all of the lenders in line. It's getting all the lawyers in line. It's getting, all of the, technical due diligence. and it really depends on how well an application is submitted, okay? So typically, a large project finance transaction, you could look at a period, anywhere from 9 months to a year and a half or 2 years. On a smaller transaction where, again, I give the example of medical equipment, I mean, that process can take as short as 3 months, for example. An application is submitted. Basically, we need to look at the balance sheet. We need to look at the contract, and we do the due diligence. So that's very quick, okay? Like that type of a transaction, a medium-term transactions could take as short as 3 months if all the documentation submitted is there. In the case of a short-term transaction, it's a question of days, frankly. If you have, for example, like as I mentioned, a lot of the commodity-driven financing that we do is done by way of a letter of credit. Generally, who's applying for that insurance is a U.S. lender. That takes days.
Okay, thank you. The next question is quite specific. Would an operator for oil field or mineral quarry qualify? Would they require U.S. manufactured equipment?
Our mission is to always finance U.S. goods. So if that operator is buying U.S. goods and services, we can provide financing. So the answer, I'm not quite sure I fully understand the question, but remember, our mission, we are financing U.S. goods and services. So if the operator is buying U.S. goods and services, we can, yes.
Maybe the person who typed it will ask further, but perhaps they mean if it was a quarry operator, would they be able to receive financing even if some of the equipment perhaps came from somewhere else?
Okay, so a quarry operator in Oman, for example, correct?
Yeah.
A quarry operator could have, a classic example would be, let's say, there are certain U.S. companies that, for example, in mining equipment, okay, some very big U.S. companies of which we are very proud of, Caterpillar, John Deere, and there are some foreign companies that have manufacturing operations in the U.S., even foreign companies that have manufacturing operations, provided that they manufactured in the U.S. and they sell mining equipment, we can provide financing. Now, that quarry operator, that doesn't mean that he must have 100%, U.S. goods, okay, in the mine. And I'm sure they would have, equipment from all over, but our financing would be limited to whatever is U.S. goods. I don't know if I answered the question, but.
Yeah, so even if it is a U.S. operator operating here in Oman.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, if it's a U.S. operator, the only time when we cannot provide financing will be if it's an intra-company transaction. If that operator, okay, well, let's say it's a U.S. company operating in Oman, okay, if they are selling from somehow their plant in the U.S., that would be construed an intra-company transaction. Under that scenario, we would not be able to do it. But if it's a U.S. operator and we like the credit, then yeah, we could finance it.
Okay, thank you. I think we just have about 2 more questions left. Says, thank you everyone for the presentations. I understand that identifying a U.S. trade partner is required. But is it possible to pursue a pre-approval process with EXIM when the U.S. partner is still unknown. So they know they'd like to work with you. They want to find a partner and they're early in the process.
Right. So it is typical, okay, that under a bidding process, under a request for proposals, okay, you may have buyers who have not yet identified, their source of equipment, okay? So in principle, we can work, okay, with some Omani companies to provide some general indication on the credit of that Omani company, okay? So there is a possibility that we can, I wouldn't say that we would do full due diligence because yet, a contract has not been signed and, and obviously we will not be, we would not have all of the, information to actually analyze the whole credit. But I think an informal process before actually entering into a contract or before identifying the actual U.S. export or U.S. counterparty, an informal process as to the credit worthiness of the buyer on EXIM Bank's appetite for risk can be started, yes.
Okay, great. And the last question may have been covered already in some ways, but perhaps you could sum it up again for our viewers. What forms of guarantees do you require to finance a project?
Right, that's a really good question. Right. So as I mentioned, we are a finance agency. In a case such as in project finance, okay, we are looking very much at the risks, okay, and we're looking at the off-takers and we're looking at the contracts, okay. Those in where, for example, let's say the project, obviously it has to be built, okay, we may be needing, and we are concerned about the construction risk, we may be needing, completion guarantees from the EPC contractor, for example, okay? In the case of a balance sheet transaction, remember a borrower is a corporate, most of our financing, okay, is senior unsecured debt. So what does it mean, senior unsecured debt, okay? What that means is that as a lender, we are senior, okay, but we are unsecured. Most of the project finance is kind of senior and secured because there is a lot more risk, okay? It's senior and secured. Most of the aircraft transactions that we do are senior and secured, okay? All the other transactions, generally, we are senior and unsecured. That means that if we like the credit risk, we're looking at the balance sheet, we like the credit risk, we do not need any more guarantees. But so we are taking the risk of the balance sheet. We're taking the risk that the borrower can repay back that loan. In the case where we analyze the credit and deem the credit weak, okay, then we will need to have some credit enhancements, okay? Then we will need to find whether, that the credit can be structured in a way that it reduces the risk. In that case, we may need to look at a parent, for example, that has a stronger financial condition. We may need to look at a financial institution providing credit. We may need to share in the risk, okay, with the financial institution. So really, that's the answer. I mean, the guarantee, in the case of a public sector transaction, which I don't really see too many in, I see more private sector, and that's the way it should be. It should be market driven. It should be the private sector creating jobs. But in Africa, for example, we see a lot of sovereign transactions because there's a lot of infrastructure and they need our financing because for Africa getting access to cheap financing is very difficult. In that case, we see public sector transactions where the sovereign backs the credit. So that is the various scenarios of credits that we put together, where you may need credit enhancement, where you may need guarantees, where you do not need guarantees, where you need to, mitigate some of the risks depending on the risks.
Okay, thank you very, very much. You can see it's beginning to get dark here in Oman, where I'm sitting. What is the best way for people to start a conversation or to begin the process? Would you like anyone from this call to email you, or is there someone else that we should reach out to and have them contact the email address?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You could have them email me, and I'll, even though I'm engaged in so many other things, but I will be pleased to provide guidance, assistance, and introductions to the right people. It'd be my pleasure.
That's wonderful. Thank you again for your time. You're on Zoom and our members are on YouTube, but they're all thanking you there for the presentation. We really appreciate it. And we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Okay, great. It's been my pleasure, my honor, and hope to see you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.